case. Bioptics is what is going to be told to you all about during this presentation, and how to take up these cases. What are the challenges you face, and what are the pre-op workups for each surgery in that order, whether you're doing ICL or you're doing a corneal surgery. So I think I'll give it over to Avilasha. Please start.
Good afternoon, everyone. So we have a 23-year-old female who presented to the OPD for refractive surgery for cosmetic reasons. She has a history of spectacle use of 13 years, and the last pair of spectacles was changed 5 years back. There is no history of contact lens usage. There was no history of previous ocular surgery, ocular trauma, or usage of any ocular drugs. There is no history of any systemic illness. So on ocular examination, the uncorrected visual acuity was 1/60 in both eyes. The best corrected visual acuity was 6/6 in both eyes. On slit lamp examination, the anterior segment was found to be within normal limits in both the eyes. The direct and consensual light reflex was present. On gonioscopy, there was open angles in both eyes. On dilated fundus examination, the glow was present. Media was clear. The cup disc ratio was 0.3:1. NRR was healthy. Tilted disc was present. Peripapillary atrophy. The FR was sharp. The AVR ratio was 2:3, and CR degeneration was present. There was no peripheral treatable lesion in this patient. The CCT was found to be 546 microns in the right eye and 541 in the left eye. IOP on non-contact tonometry was 15 in the right eye and 13 in the left eye. Refraction under HA 2% was done, and in the right eye it was -20 sphere with -3.5 cylinder at 20-degree axis, and in the left eye it was -20 sphere with -3.5 cylinder at 140-degree axis. The endo ACD was found to be 3.008 in the right eye and 3.045 in the left eye. The wide to wide by IOL master was found to be 12 mm in both eyes, and by calipers it was 11.64 in the right eye and 11.68 in the left eye. The axial length was 30.15 in the right eye and 29.95 in the left eye. The specular count was 3250 cells per millimeter square in the right eye and 3286 in the left eye. The power of glasses which the patient was using was -18 sphere, and in left eye it was -18 sphere with -0.25 cylinder at 120-degree axis. The post-mydriatic test which was done was found to be in the right eye -20 sphere with -3.5 cylinder at 20-degree axis, and the patient had 6/6 vision with this. And the left eye, it was -20 sphere and -3.5 cylinder at 170-degree axis, which the patient had 6/6 with this vision, PMT. So on pentacam, the K1 was found to be 44 diopters in the right eye, and the steeper axis was 46.7 at 106.3 degree axis in the right eye, and in the left eye, it was K1 was 44.1 and the steeper axis was 47 diopters at 80-degree axis. And the thinnest pachymetry was in the right eye was 537 and the left eye was 534. The ACD was 3.43 in the right eye and 3.46 in the left eye. The pupillary diameter was 3.12 in the right eye and 3.15 in the left eye. The posterior elevation was +10 and +14 in the right eye and left eye. Kmax was 46.9 and 47.2 in right eye and left eye respectively. The D value was 0.53 and 1.15 in the right and left eye. So here we see the pentacam with 4 map refractive. So we see the demographic details here, and the quality specification was okay in this case, so the values were reliable. The first map is a sagittal curvature map in which we can see the K1 and K2 with a bow tie configuration and with the rule astigmatism. The elevation in the front and back of the cornea was found to be within normal limits, and the pachymetry apex was 538 and the thinnest location was 537. On bad map, we can see it was within normal limits for both elevation of back and front. The D value was 0.53, which is less than 1.6, and the CTSP and PTI was found to be within the two standard deviations within the 6 mm pupil diameter. And the pentacam, this is for the left eye. Similarly, the Q specification is okay, and we can again see a bow tie configuration with the rule astigmatism, and the elevation was within normal limits. The D value in this case is 1.15, and we have a normal bad map in both anterior front and the back surface, and the red line is within the 2 standard deviations. This is the ASOCT map for the right eye, ASOCT for the right eye, in which we can see the endo-ACD, which is the distance from the endothelium of the cornea to the anterior surface of the lens, which was 3.008 for the right eye, and for the left eye it is 3.045. So if the patient was to undergo a corneal refractive surgery, the residual stromal bed thickness, that would be negative in both eyes, and this is what we ideally want for the patient. PTA is the percentage tissue ablation, which would have been 87.5 in the right eye and 88.01 in the left eye. So ideal should have been it should have been less than 40%. So in decision making, the patient was highly motivated for refractive surgery, and there was no contraindication for the same. So hence refractive surgery can be performed, as the calculated PTA was more than 40% with no residual stromal bed thickness. So lens-based procedure was suitable for this patient. As the refractive error is more than 18 sphere, the maximum power in which phakic IOL available is -18. So we have to plan a bioptics for this patient. As endo-ACD was more than 2.8 mm in both eyes, and astigmatism was more than 1 diopters, so toric phakic IOL was planned, followed by a second stage corneal refractive surgery. So this is the ICL performer for calculation of the patient. So the first stage we did an ICL. So the power calculated was -18 sphere with 2.5 cylinder at 89° axis, and for the left eye it was -18 sphere with 2.5 cylinder at 82 axis. So the target lens was the following with at 110° axis, but what we got was an 89° axis. So we had to hence place it in 21° counterclockwise. Similarly, for the left eye, the lens which we got was for 80° axis. The target lens was at 80 degrees, and the lens which we got was 82 degrees. So hence we had to rotate it clockwise at 2 degrees. So this was the target. We were expecting this much of an error after the ICL, which was -3.47 sphere with +0.23 cylinder at 100 axis. And what we wanted to expect, from the left eye, it was -3.52 sphere and +0.28 at 85° axis. So post-op day 1, the vision unaided was 6/36 and best credit visual acuity was 6/6. So refraction, it was -3 diopter sphere with -1.25 cylinder at 20° axis, and the left eye it was -3.25 sphere with -1.25 cylinder at 180° axis. The vault was 715 microns in the right eye and 819 in the left eye. The endo-ACD was 2.977 in the right eye and 3.017 in the left eye. The IOP was 18 and 20 in the right eye and left eye respectively. So this was the ASOCT on day 1 post-op. So vault was showing 715. So this is the distance between the posterior surface of the ICL and the anterior surface of the crystalline lens. And the vault in this, the left eye, it was 819. So post-ICL management, the patient was prescribed glasses for the following power, and the vision was 6/6 in both the eyes. Further discussion will be carried on by Dr. Sanket.
Yeah, so you've seen that the few things which are important here is that you have to see the residual bed thickness and the PTA. In this case, it was not possible to do the corneal surgery. It was going negative actually. So that's one of the things you have to calculate very seriously, see how it's happening. Although one eye, the D value was 1.15, the other one was much better, but even that was good enough to go ahead for a refractive surgery. Now, what we not want to do now is a refractive surgery to the extent that for about a 3.5 cell and a 3.5 sphere and a 1.25 cell. So now this case is now suited for the refractive corneal surgery, which Sanket is going to tell us how to go about it.
Good evening, everyone. I'll be continuing with the discussion ahead. So, the patient was operated for ICL in the month of January, and after the lockdown, patient came to us in the month of December, and then we had done the LASIK examination, that was post ICL or the pre LASIK examination, where the uncorrected visual acuity was 6 by 36 in both the eyes, and the best corrected visual acuity was 6 by 6. And the pachymetry available for us in the right eye was 546 and in the left eye was 541 microns, and the posterior elevation was plus 17 and plus 16 in the right and left eye respectively. The Kmax was 47 in both the eyes. The pressures were within normal limits, 12 millimeters of mercury, and the refractive error was minus 3 diopter sphere and minus 1.25 cylinder at 20 degrees in the right eye, and minus 3 diopter sphere and minus 1.25 diopter cylinder at 180 in the left eye. The endo ACD was 2.9 and 3 in the right and left eye respectively. The volt was 497 in the right eye and 587 in the left eye. And the residual stromal bed thickness was 336 in the right eye and 331 in the left eye. And the PTA was 31% and both the eyes, which was less than 40%. So we can go ahead with a refractive surgery. And the bad map was okay in both the eyes. So this was the Pentacam pre-LASIK, where you can see the steeper axis was 46 and 43 in the horizontal one, and the axis was 102 degrees, and it is with the rule astigmatism. The pachymetry at the apex was 548, and the elevations were anterior, front and back elevations were within normal limit. And this was the bad map of the right eye, and you can see both front and back difference were within normal limit, and the D value was 0.75. This was the left eye, again with the rule astigmatism, and the front and the back elevations were within normal limit, and the thinnest pachy was 541 microns. And this is the bad map of the left eye, which was again both front and back difference were within normal limit, and the D value was 0.91. And this was the ASOCT done before LASIK. You can see the volt was 497 and the endo ACD was 2.9. This is of the left eye, the volt was 587 and the endo ACD was 3.01. So we went ahead with LASIK considering the spherical as well as the cylindrical refractive error of the patient, and this is a short clip of the surgical video. So this was done on a MEL 90 machine, and we took a 100 micron flap, and this was the docking, and followed by infrared rays for pupillary fixation.
This was on the Visumax actually. The femtocut is on the Visumax and the excimer is on the MEL 90.
So the flap was made, and so you lift the flap and you dry the surface, and followed by excimer laser, and then the flap was placed, and then you check for apposition of the flap. And on day 1 post-op examination, the uncorrected visual acuity was 6 by 6 in both the eyes, and the pachymetry was 492 and 491 respectively, and the posterior elevation was plus 14 and plus 12. The Kmax was 45.1 and 45.2, and the pressures were normal, and the residual refractive error on day 1 post-op was minus 0.25 diopter sphere and minus 0.5 diopter cylinder at 10 degrees, and in the left eye it was only minus 0.5 diopter cylinder at 30 degrees. And the endo ACD was 2.8 and 2.8 both eyes, and the volt in the right eye was 427 and in the left eye was 533. So this was the Pentacam of right eye post LASIK, and you can see a well-centered ablation in the right eye, and this was the bad map which was within normal limits again, and this was the LASIK Pentacam of the left eye, again a well-centered ablation, and this was the bad map which was again within normal limits. This was the ASOCT. Volt was 427, and you can see the interface of the flap here, and this was of the left eye, the volt was 533, and here is the interface. This was the clinical image of the right eye day 1, and you can see a very well opposed LASIK flap here, and this was the ICL, and this was of the left eye day 1 post-op. So in short, pre-ICL the patient had a refractive error of right eye minus 20 diopter sphere and minus 3.5 cylinder, and left eye minus 20 diopter sphere and minus 3.5 diopter cylinder. And post ICL, the refractive error was reduced to minus 3 diopter sphere in minus 1.25 cylinder, and left eye minus 3.25 and minus 1.25 cylinder. Hence, we proceeded with the corneal-based refractive surgery, that was LASIK, and the residual refractive on day 1 of post-LASIK was minus 0.25 diopter sphere and minus 0.5 cylinder in the right eye and minus 0.5 diopter cylinder in the left eye. So bioptics terminology was suggested by Zaldivar in late 1990s. It is basically a combination of two refractive procedures, which is one is intraocular and the other is on the corneal based. So this is usually done to correct refractive errors which are suboptimally corrected by a single procedure alone. And these are the various type of refractive surgeries. It can either be corneal based, lens based, or bioptics. So corneal based could be either incisional or laser based. Lens based are phakic IOLs, which can be either angle supported, iris fixated, or posterior chamber, or you can do a refractive lens exchange. And the combination of these two would be bioptics. So these are the normal ranges for various refractive surgeries. As in our patient, the refractive error was minus 3 diopter sphere and 1.5 cylinder. So we went ahead with LASIK in this patient. So there are few studies on bioptics. I'll be discussing only few basic ones. This was a study conducted which was comparing the posterior chamber phakic IOL along with LASIK for bioptic surgery. They found that bioptics for high myopic astigmatism was a safe and effective one, and the vaulting does not appear to be affected followed by LASIK or PRK. And this was a combined posterior chamber phakic IOL lens and LASIK bioptics for extreme myopia. Here they had corrected a refractive error with a mean spherical equivalent of minus 18 to minus 35 diopters, and they found good results in this study. And again, LASIK and PRK can both be used for a residual refractive error after phakic IOL implant. Both can be equally efficacious. However, the regression was seen more with PRK. And bioptics with LASIK flap first for the treatment of high ametropia was also been described, where you create a corneal flap followed by IOL implantation 3 days later. And once you place the flap back, you wait for 3 months, and later on you lift the flap and do the ablation of the residual refractive error. And this was another paper on bioptics where they have done with using SMILE instead of LASIK. And they've had done in a mean spherical equivalent of minus 22 diopters. And they found that SMILE following ICL was a valid option for extremely myopic patient. Then if the patient is not suitable for either LASIK or for PCIL, then a clear lens extraction would be a viable option in the patients. In short, to conclude, if first of all, when a patient comes to you, you have to assess the age and the refractive stability of the patient. If no, then you again wait and repeat the refraction after 6 months or 1 year. If the patient is suitable, then you take a detailed history examination, pachymetry, and all the investigations which we have shown you. And if all the parameters are within normal limit, if the RSBT is more than 250, PT is less than 40, and the posterior elevation and bad maps are within normal limit, you go ahead with a corneal refractive surgery. And the various types would be surface ablation like PRK, LASIK, or SMILE. Surface ablations are usually done for low refractive errors and epithelial abnormalities. LASIK is more suitable for most of the cases, including high cylinders. SMILE is more suitable for low cylindrical power. And if all these parameters are not good, then you go ahead with a lens-based surgery. And if the refractive error is less than 18 diopters and endo-ACD is more than 3, then you go with phakic IOL. If not, then you go with bioptics, where the accommodation is preserved in young patients. And if the age is more than 40 years, you go ahead with a clear lens extraction or a refractive lens exchange. So to conclude, patient motivation is of utmost importance in any refractive surgery, and pre-op proper counseling is very, very, very essential to meet patients' expectation post-operatively. And bioptics is a safe procedure to treat high myopia, which are difficult to be treated by a single corneal procedure alone. And you can do all LASIK, PRK, SMILE, all can be used safely to treat the residual refractive error post phakic IOL. Thank you.
Yeah, that's nice. So I think it's open for discussion now. The only thing is you should be doing the clear lens section 45, 50, because by the time the accommodation is already gone for a toss. So, and if there's no cylinder in the eyes, you can put up trifocal lenses, which give very good results. So, any questions, anybody?
Sir, there is a question from Dr. Ashwini.
Okay.
The
Yes,
he is
what's the
asking
question?
if patient is not able to afford ICL, then is it a good idea to go ahead with clear lens extraction?
I think I already answered that. If the patient is, you have to find out what is more important for the patient, the accommodation or no accommodation. If the accommodation is important, that means the patient is less than 40, 45 years of age, then he can use glasses or contact lenses. But if the patient comes to me in my OPD at 45 years and maybe between 45 and 50, I would definitely go for a clear lens extraction I won't call it a clear lens, I would call it a refractive lens extraction with trifocal implanted in that. Indian trifocals also work very well.
What should be the gap between lens-based and corneal procedure in bioptics?
Okay, so I think according to literature, they have between 2 months to 6 months, but it's safest to keep it minimum of 6 months.
Yes, just Sanket, one question. Was there any change in corneal topography between the two procedures?
So
Before ICL and whatever you got just before femto LASIK?
Sir, there was not much of a change in the.
Sanket?
Sir. Yes, sir. Hello. Oh, sir, there was not enough change in the CCT was within normal limit and the keratometry was also normal. There was no change in
There is
the.
no significant change, right?
No
Even
No,
if
no
you are
significant
making
change.
it 3.2, still
Yeah.
it is not that significant change there. Okay. So
It doesn't.
Dr. Sohini is asking one question, that is, sir, could we have done IPCL implantation in such cases? Is the range of such cases is till minus 30 diopter?
Okay, now I think you asked a very good question. Why can't the ICL people make more than minus 18? Why can't they go 20, 24, 25? In the last meeting we had before the lockdown for the ICL, that was about a year back, year and a half now. In that, I asked this question. They said they tried it in the labs. They came out with the models which were minus 20 earlier, but they realized that there were more of abrasions happening with that kind of high power. So that's why they continued. So they said that they should not be used at all, especially when they have a V4C model in which they want to make an opening in the center. If the center goes too thin or too thick, then the viability of the opening in the center doesn't work, and these eyes are more prone to tapering. So Indian-made companies, IPCL and all those, they give you customized power, but I think after a certain power, it actually is not going to work in the favor of the patient. It might give more aberrations than anything else.
Dr. Abhijit asking, should we do eye trace in very high myopes or DLI before refractive surgery?
Okay, so you want to check out what the cataract rate is. See, if you see these myopic patients, they'll start having these lenticular changes early in life. Like at the age of 40, 45, they might have a little bit of sclerosis, which is more than a normal population. So if your DLI is there and the patient is willing to give away the near vision accommodation, you can use it, yes, DLI. But eye trace is other way also useful in these patients. Once you've done the first surgery, I think somebody asked why the ICL did not correct the full keratometry in the first place. Although what they were expecting was a 0.28 plus 0.28 cell, but it has a 1.25. See, what happens is when you're doing the surgery, your surgery 2.2 can induce from astigmatism 1. Second, all these refractive, even if you put toric IOLs in these patients, you realize that the toricity is never totally taken care of, because what you correct is you calculate it on the corneal surface. What you do it is inside the eye. So there's always a little match. That's why the refractive corneal procedures like a LASIK will correct the cylinder much better than intraocular lens. I hope that answers the question. Prafulla, we have noticed that even if we do toric IOLs, you always have a 0.25, 0.75, but patient is not taking glasses. Even this patient is not using glasses. But yes, if you measure the sill, it will still be there. 0.5 will be there, and most of the toric IOLs also, despite the best of the corrections and the online alignments and everything. Okay, so we got 5 more minutes. Wrap up our batting, unit 1. Any other question there? About the material, people talk about IPCL, yes, but again, IPCL material is something which I'll be happy to use for the IOLs, not for the phakic lenses, because you have to, save the endothelium in the front and, and the lenticular surface at the back. So I've done few cases. The patients are doing fine, but still at the back of my mind, there's always a little issue that these patients, once they have, they might have cataract formation earlier. But
So doctor, yeah,
most
there is
studies are
one more
coming and
question.
people have started using IPSL in a big way. So I think let's hope. And I don't have too much experience with IPSL, but I think I'll be happy to use it. And let's see how it works over maybe a decade or so. Whereas ICL we've been using for the last 20, 25 years now. So there's no issue like that.
Sir,
Yep.
how to decide whether ICL first or LASIK first
Okay.
for diabetes?
Okay. Yeah. So if the patient comes to me, anybody who's more than 18, so first thing is that corneal refractive alone is out. Second option is some people say you undercorrect to some extent and we'll wear the glasses. So even if there's a minus 18, maximum you can take out is 6, 7, maybe maximum 8. Let's put it 8. Still you got a 10 diopter, so you corneal refractive alone first is out, these patients. So you try to plan the maximum with the ICL, with the phakic lenses, and then you wait for 6 months. And your cornea, if if, or for example, if the cornea is already say 450 or 480, less than 500, then even the ICL alone is not enough. Those are the patients who might use glasses later on. So when you see the pachymetry on the first go, that's the only time you can always tell the patient in the beginning only that we'll be going for cornea surgery later on or not. And this patient was very, very well. I mean, she was hell bent. She wanted a refractive surgery. So first I told her not to do anything, go wear your glasses, come back and be happy. She said, if you don't do it, I'll get it done out somewhere. So then that's okay, might as well, we might as well do it. So we done about, in the last, I think 5 years, we done about 10 patients in which we done bioptics, and we tried SMILE, we done PRK, and we done LASIK, all three. In this patient, since the SIL was of 1.25, that's why I went ahead with the LASIK. Otherwise, I would have been happier doing a SMILE of this patient. So it's always ICL first, take out the maximum possible, and then whatever is left is you can do it on the surface. Suction during, Ashwini has written something.
Ashwin is asking if there is any impact on the suction that we create during LASIK because
Yeah.
of the ICL surgery.
Yeah. So I think that's a very good question. Because of that, in the initial phase when they started doing all these surgeries, they used to create a flap first and not zap. They used to use Alzheimer. They used to raise the flap, put it back, then go with the IOL surgery so that there's no pressure. But with all these new machines which have come up now, like if you start using Visumax, you see the pressure it applies on the application for cutting is hardly any. Yes, and there are 2, 3 papers in which they found out that the vaulting of the ICLs does not change. So that means whatever pressure applies, it's temporary only, and it does not cause the change in the vault. So thus, it is not going to push the ICL onto the surface of the lens and cause cataract, if that is what he's asking.
But sir, creating flap is still an option, right? First we
Yeah,
can create
of
the
course,
flap and go for
of
ICL.
course, of course. You can create a flap, put the flap back, it will stick back again. Then you go and do your ICL after maybe a week's time, and then maybe a month or 2 months after that, you can just raise the flap. You can just draw. You can just pick it up on the slit lamp and do it. It can be very easily picked up. No, that's what used to be done earlier with the older machines.
Yeah,
With the
earlier
new
that was.
machines, the suction has come very well controlled, so you can do either way actually.
Sir, how are the results of presbyopic eye correction with ICL? Dr. Priyadarshana is asking this question.
Tell me what are the correction with the press band. I'll tell you this one. So I have recruited 4 people with phakic, presbyopic IOS, but the lenses have not reached me yet. So the moment they come, I'll do it and inform you. I was trying to recruit these people for presbyond, but nobody is willing to get their cornea, both eyes surgery done on the cornea for near correction. Whereas ICL being put in one eye, people are willing. So I've got 4 patients who are already recruited, but I haven't done any yet. So the moment they come, I think once I do it, I'll inform you. Sure. Next meeting.
Thank you, sir. I think we can move on to next class. It's
Please will do that.
4:30 now.
Thank you, Praful, and bye. Take care.
Good evening, everyone. Continuing the case presentation, I am Dr. Rajat, second semester JR, presenting you a case. A 20 years old male presented with complaint of floaters in the right eye since 15 days. He also complained of blurring of vision in the right eye since 10 days. There was no history of redness or watering in any eyes. There is no history of flashes of light or any metamorphosia. Patient denies any history of fever or weight loss. There was no history of mouth ulcers or any genital ulcers. Also, patient denies no joint pains, skin involvement or any chronic illness. On elicitation of history, patient tells a positive past history, which is he complained of similar episodes of floaters in both the eyes 1 year ago, which was also associated with blurring of the vision in the both eyes. Following fundus evaluation, systemic evaluation, and area of investigation, he was diagnosed as sequelae to retinal vasculitis, for which scatter laser was done of choroidal capillary non-perfusion areas in the both eyes. On examination, the cardiovascular system was normal. The central nervous system was also normal. Also, the abdominal examination and the respiratory system examination was normal. There was no stigmata of systemic disease was present. On ocular examination, the best corrected visual acuity in the right eye was 6/9 and in the left eye it was 6/6. Refraction was done. In the right eye it was +1 diopter spare and -0.5 diopter cylinder at 90 degrees axis and with the acceptance of 6/9. In the left eye, the power was 0.5 diopter spare and 0.5 diopter cylinder at 90 degree with acceptance of 6/6. The IOP in the right eye was 16 mmHg and in left eye was 14 mmHg. The anterior segment findings were within normal limit. In posterior segment, this was fundus CP done on previous visit, January 2019. The patient, there's a point that patient was already taking steroid for 2 weeks before the first visit to the RPC. In the right eye, we can see the perivascular sheathing, and we can see superior vitreous hemorrhage. The media is clear. The disc is vertically oval, and the macula appears normal. In the left eye, there is also we can see perivascular sheathing and some area of non-perfusion with pre-retinal hemorrhages.
Just a minute. Go back to that photograph.
Yes,
Rajat?
yes, sir.
Yeah, for the residents, I think maybe you might have to enlarge it on your screens if you are on the mobile or something. But I hope you can appreciate the sheathing along the vessels. So basically, this is to show you that these are, since the patient was already taking steroids for 2 weeks, so he is in a partial stage of resolution of the vasculitis. So there's not florid vasculitis seen here, but you can see some of the sequelae like the sheathing where he's pointing out in the right eye, and there's no superior vitreous hemorrhage, but maybe some hemorrhages on the retinal surface only. And similarly in the left eye you have these areas of sheathing, but here you also in the nasal part have a patch of active vasculitis. So please describe the features of active vasculitis here, Rajat, again.
So there we can see perivascular sheathing and cuffing, and there is pre-retinal hemorrhages.
So there is edema there, retinal edema. So you can see there is some graying of the retina there, plus associated hemorrhages and cuffing. So these are active signs of active vasculitis. Sheathing, classically we'll call it for a healed vasculitis, but once if you get cuffing in a sequence, like the entire vessel is cuffed, so it will also mimic sheathing. So I don't know, are the residents getting the difference between sheathing and cuffing? So classically we call cuffing, that is having gaps and small cuffs of whiteness around the vessels, is a feature of active vasculitis, whereas sheathing, where you just see white lines which are in continuity along the vessels, is like a sign of healed vasculitis. Presence of retinal hemorrhages and retinal edema definitely suggests that there is some active vasculitis present. Okay, so at this time, since the patient was already on steroids, he is in a phase of partial resolution. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Fundus fluorescein angiography was done. In the left eye, it shows perivascular leaking. We can see here, and in the right eye, we can see also diffuse perivascular leaking and the focal leaking, as well as hyperfluorescence of the disc, which might be suggestive of hyperemia of the disc.
Just a minute. Sorry, again, you have mentioned the eyes opposite here. So in the right eye, the larger vessels are definitely showing hyperfluorescence along the vessel wall. Okay, so but this can also be seen not just in active vasculitis. As the vasculitis is healing, then also some amount of this hyperfluorescence persists. So FA alone is not a definite marker of activity. You have to assess it clinically also. So like if clinically the vessels were all normal and if there was little bit of leakage on FA, I would still not call it active vasculitis. It is just some perivascular staining of the vessels. But if you see the other eye, if you see the left eye, now here apart from the larger vessels, you see the capillary bed itself is also leaking. The smaller vessels are also showing you a lot of leakage. So here definitely the blood retinal barrier is broken much more and there is some element of activity there. Plus this other patch of fluorescence, increased fluorescence that he was showing you, that is probably an early neovascularization developing. And apart from that, what is this? Yes, Rajat, that you are marking?
Sir, this is capillary non-perfusion areas.
Okay, so you see that large areas of capillary non-perfusion and the neovascularization tends to develop at the edge of the perfused and the non-perfused retina. So this is quite corroborating. So it's probably a small patch of neovascularization there. With more. Okay, so Abhijit is saying collateral. So yes, some of these tortuous vessels, some of them, yes, collateral formation is also occurring there.
सर इरमा नहीं बोलेंगे ना यहाँ पे.
No, IRMA is a specific term generally we use for diabetic retinopathy.
Diabetes only. ठीक. Okay, sir.
Okay, go ahead.
This is the fundus CP of the current visit. The left eye, in the left eye, we can see there's a.
Please do see this is the right eye. Right eye.
In the right eye, we can see there's a media haze is present with the previous laser marks. We can see. In the left eye, there is no signs of activity. We can also see FA guided laser marks.
Okay, just a minute again. So, looking at those capillary non-perfusion areas and the early neovascularization, scatter laser was performed in both the eyes, more in the left eye. So now, if you go back to what he said, patient has come back after almost 1.5 to 2 years with again complaints in the right eye. So if you see the right eye photograph alone, probably you'll say there is no media haze. But if you compare the photographs, I think there is definite slight difference in sharpness of the right eye photograph. So maybe a little mild haze, but not too much. Grossly, if you see these photographs, you might just conclude that nothing is happening, everything is normal. Okay, go ahead.
The fundus fluorescein angiography of the current visit. The right eye shows again perivascular leaking, and whereas left eye shows relatively silent inactivity with the laser marks present.
I think the discussant will discuss this FA, so go ahead.
Okay, further discussion will be taken by Dr.
Good evening, everyone. Continuing with the case discussion, it's a brief summary. We had a young healthy male of 20 years of age with complaint of floaters in the right eye with no systemic symptoms. And the fundus evaluation showed both eye peripheral perivascular sheathing, which was patchy in nature currently, and right eye showed mild vitreous hemorrhage with relative inactivity at the posterior pole with scatter laser marks on the follow-up visit. So basically, this based on the history and examination, we can make a provisional diagnosis as a retinal vasculitis, among which we have a differential diagnosis based on the involvement. Could be a primary arteritis, could be a primary phlebitis, or both. So out of these, we suspected either it could be an Eales or a Behcet's disease. We got array of investigations done, most of which were within normal limits. The complete blood count was within normal limit. Blood chemistry, serum ACE levels, VDRL, and serology for HIV, HBsAg, and anti-HCV were also within negative.
Just a minute. So all these investigations actually probably we have not got done. They were done outside because he was already being treated. So are these all of these essential?
To rule out other causes of vasculitis, basically Eales, we end up diagnosing it as diagnosis of exclusion. So we have to rule out all the causes of vasculitis before diagnosing it as Eales vasculitis.
No, still in whatever I didn't see this list yesterday. Since still in whatever list you are showing, are these all of them essential? What do you gain by getting rheumatoid factor here?
Spondyloarthropathies are ruled out, sir.
No, rheumatoid factor generally is, even if positive, patient may have only scleritis. Generally, posterior uveitis vasculitis has no relation to rheumatoid factor, so it is absolutely unnecessary again. What about ANA and ANCA?
Sir, ANA and ANCA related vasculitis could be ruled out, and ANA we can rule out SLE and AS sarcoidosis.
Okay, so from what you are saying, then it means that in all cases of vasculitis, you will get this shortcut type of approach and get everything done.
No, sir. We basically clinical examination is the primary for any vasculitis. Based upon the examination findings, then we'll go for ancillary testings like fluorescent angiography if required. Then
so this depends on the systemic clinical examination, yes, right, and the systemic symptoms. Yes. So since your patient is already told you so many things systemically, is absolutely healthy.
Yes, sir.
And so probably in this patient, ANA and ANCA again is wasting his money unless he's getting repeated attacks or something else. Maybe we might think of. But on the first go, I would only probably recommend just getting a hemogram, and if you suspect, you can do serum ACE levels for sarcoid because it's a common etiology and nothing else. Again, see, HSV, HBsAg, hepatitis are
not necessary.
Very, very rare. Maybe someone can get a inflammation in the eye and vasculitis, not at all common. And serology for HIV, why in a 20-year-old male who's probably not having any risk factors for HIV? Okay, VDRL might be a mimic for anything can get done. So probably just a serum ACE level, a VDRL and a blood count as a baseline if you want to give immunosuppressants also later or something. So just these three investigations and maybe a chest X-ray. Don't go with an idea that even if this patient has these investigations, you should not be getting these done in all your cases.
Yes, sir.
Okay, go ahead.
We had got Fundus CP on 19th of December, which was his first visit, 2019. So basically, we can see there is patchy perivascular sheathing in both the eyes with area of retinal edema with pre-retinal hemorrhages. Could be explaining because the patient might be in the healing phase, because patient was already started on steroids when patient visited us. He got on visit in private hospital where they started him on steroids. FA on 19 December, which was his first visit. The right eye, as the FA progressed in the mid phase and late phase, we could see CNP areas were there, and there was diffuse perivascular leakage. It was not diffuse perivascular leakage could be seen. And in the left eye, as Rajat explained, also there is a capillary non-perfusion areas with collaterals, and there is focal leak, could be because of neovascularization. And left eye also showed diffuse perivascular leak, which was almost like a fern-like pattern. So on first visit, both eyes scatter laser of CNP areas and area of focal leak was done in the left eye. The patient was asymptomatic for a period of 1 year, but he developed floaters and blurring of vision in the right eye for 15 days prior to the second visit. So this was the Fundus CP on the second visit, which is January 18, 2021. Grossly, both the eyes appear normal. Comparatively, the right eye has small amount of vitreous haze. Apart from that, there was no as such as clinical activity in both the eyes. This was the FFA done on 18 January 2021, and the left eye is relatively silent in all the phases of FA. Apart from the laser scatter laser marks, rest appears, fundus appears, and FA appears normal. While in the right eye, there was diffuse perivascular leakage, which appeared like a diffuse fern-like pattern. So, management after second visit was following the evaluation of fundus and FFA. It was observed that patient had recurrence in the right eye while left eye was relatively quiet. So we started him on oral steroids, and the patient is due for third visit now. So final diagnosis we had come to it is it could be an idiopathic retinal vasculitis or could be a Behçet's disease. The points that are aiding in our diagnosis is patient has recurrent inflammation in the eye. This patchy perivascular sheathing on the fundus evaluation with predominant involvement of veins then in arteries, and on FA there was diffuse like fern-like pattern, which is characteristic finding and most frequently encountered pattern in the Behçet's disease. So retinal vasculitis is basically a descriptive term used to explain a conglomerate of typical clinical manifestation, including perivascular sheathing, cuffing, vascular leakage, or occlusion. It could be a primary arteritis, it could be primary phlebitis, or both. This was a classification of retinal vasculitis which was done according to the Chapel-Hill nomenclature. Basically, eye vasculitis without systemic involvement, eye vasculitis with primary systemic vasculitis, which included small vessel, medium vessel, and large vessel, and eye vasculitis associated with autoimmune disorders. It could be a variable vessel vasculitis, vasculitis associated with systemic disease, and eye vasculitis associated with probable infectious etiology. Could be a secondary to infection or could be a masquerade. Basically, clinical staging of idiopathic vasculitis or Eales disease could be a four stage. Stage of inflammation, where we can see perivascular cuffing and retinal edema, vitritis, and inflammatory vascular occlusion. In stage of ischemia, we can see sclerosed vessels, tortuous collaterals, and CNP areas in FA. And stage of neovascularization, most common present with vitreous hemorrhage, and stage of complication is non-resolving vitreous hemorrhage, TRD, combined TRD and RRD, and neovascular glaucoma. So the role of ancillary testing in retinal vasculitis. There was a study done which aimed to study the early detection of FFA findings and OCT findings denoting active posterior uveitis in Behçet's disease. It was concluded that FFA and OCT are essential and complementary tools for early detection of ocular involvement even before it was clinically evident or for evaluation of pattern of retinal and choroidal involvement. While the role of UWFA is evolved in retinal vasculitis, there was a study done in RP Center which is the use of ultra-wide field angiography in Eales disease. So it was observed that the documentation of peripheral retinal changes, that is in 67% of eyes, was better, and the exact localization of capillary non-perfusion areas was seen in 54% of eyes, and the determination of vascular involvement in 21% of eyes. And in 33% of eyes, the immediate treatment plan was changed because of the changes picked up on UWFA. So in conclusion, and there was another study which was published in Retina, which also stated that the ultra-wide field imaging is a valuable tool in the management of patients of retinal vasculitis associated with Behçet's and can be used in diagnosis, treatment, and follow-up. Concluding that basically the ancillary testings play a vital role, but are not of but after the clinical examination. The role of periocular steroids. Periocular steroids have to be considered in case of asymmetric involvement or any contraindication for systemic use of steroids. 2 to 4 injection of triamcinolone acetonide, 40 milligram per ml, given every 2 to 3 weeks over 6 to 12 weeks.
Just a minute, I'll just, this I think we have taken it from Newson-Black,
yes, sir.
But this protocol varies from center to center. We are not giving so frequently. We are giving posterior subtenonal tricot only 20 milligram, and we generally repeat it after few months because there are very high risk of glaucoma if you are giving so frequently. And most of the patients do respond well to just a single injection. Effect does last for a few months. So we are not giving so frequently. But yes, Western literature you will find this, but probably many of them are giving peribulbar rather than posterior. Okay, go ahead.
This is a brief management of retinal vasculitis. Basically, after the workup, we have to find out the cause of retinal vasculitis. If it is an infectious cause or a non-infectious cause. If it's an infectious cause, we have to treat the specific agent. If it's a non-infectious cause, we have to look for if there is any edema. If the vision is good, if there is no cystoid macular edema or no capillary dropout, observation is done. And if treatment is indicated, we will go ahead with corticosteroids, either periocular or systemic. And if the patient is resistant to steroids or the patient becomes steroid dependent, then we go ahead with immunosuppression. So observation is done basically if visual acuity is better than 20/40, no visual complaints, mild vascular changes, none to minimal macular edema, disease not appearing to progress. The other options are corticosteroids, immunosuppressor. Surgical intervention is basically laser therapy, anti-VEGF, and vitrectomy. So in describing any case of a retinal vasculitis, we have to be, if we follow these 5 broad headings, it will be very useful. Like if it is an active vasculitis or an inactive vasculitis, if it is involving the central area or in the peripheral area, or is it involving mainly arthritis or phlebitis or both? Is it a case of an occlusive vasculitis or a non-occlusive vasculitis, or if there is an infective or a non-infective cause? Differential diagnosis based upon the ophthalmological findings in phlebitis, arthritis, cotton wool spots, intraretinal infiltrates, frosted branch angiitis, retinal ischemia, and inflammatory BRVO. The phlebitis is basically mainly Behçet's has both involvement, but mainly phlebitis is seen, but TB, pars planitis. Arthritis is seen in ARN, IRWAN, SLE, PAN. Cotton wool spots in SLE, PAN, and GPA. Intraretinal infiltrates are seen in Behçet's, rickettsial infection. Frosted branch angiitis is idiopathic infiltration of malignant cells, SLA. And retinal ischemia and tuberculosis, Behçet's. And inflammatory BRVO in Behçet's and tuberculosis.
Okay, just a minute. So again, just go back. So many authors now are assigning these specific features to tuberculosis like ischemia or inflammatory BRVO. But here again, I would like to caution you that all vasculitis, most of it that we see, specifically the phlebitis and the Eales disease type, will lead to capillary non-perfusion, and all of it is not tuberculosis. So just by seeing a lot of capillary non-perfusion, don't make it tuberculosis. Just by seeing inflammatory BRVOs, don't make it tuberculosis. But yes, again, if you read many textbooks, you are going to invariably find such tables. But you have to see that just by one observation, you cannot make an etiological diagnosis. You have to correlate it with the systemic finding also. Okay, go ahead.
Basically, the take-home message is, first, in any case, we have to determine the cause of the vasculitis, the severity of involvement, and the stage of vasculitis. And ancillary investigation like FFA may be helpful more when clinical picture does not explain any symptoms, like we had in our patient during the second visit. And the appropriate treatment based on etiology. Late recurrences are also common in retinal vasculitis and should be timely detected and managed.
Okay, so mostly, first of all, you can decide most of the cases, the management based on the clinical picture. And yes, angiography can be done to look for neovascularization and capillary non-perfusion and all those things. But sometimes when the patient is definitely telling you that there are symptoms, like our patient was saying that there are floaters, yet the vision was good, then maybe it might be a good idea to take help of these ancillary investigations, even if it might be a little extra. And like in our patient, the main thing was right eye. If you would have seen the 2021 images, there is a diffuse leakage in the small vessels. Okay, so clinically, looking at the fundus, it doesn't appear that bad at all. So here you see in the right eye, as opposed to what it was in 2019, where this diffuse leakage was more in the left eye. And now in 2021, it is more in the right eye. And yet patient's vision is okay, he's just complaining of some mild blurring with floaters. So we have just kept the differential of Behçet's because this diffuse fern-like pattern, as he showed you in few literature articles, has been typically described for Behçet's. But this patient does not give any history of oral ulcers, genital ulcers. He's a young 20-year-old healthy boy. So again, probably he is not having Behçet's. It is just idiopathic retinal vasculitis, which you can call as Eales disease. But because this FA pattern is like this, we have kept this differential. We can probably do an HLA B51, but again, HLA B51 does not come in the diagnostic algorithm. But still, we can do it. We'll see once the patient comes back. Other than that, it's basically a phlebitis. There is no other, like he told you, patches of retinitis or arterial involvement. All those things are not there in this patient. Okay, so but presentation aim was that in this you can see partly healing vasculitis. You can see that this patient needed some steroids, he needed laser. So he's gone from stage 1 to stage 2, capillary non-perfusion has developed. Fortunately, stage 3 and stage 4 has not developed, and the aim of our treatment is that these patients should not progress to stage 3 and stage 4. And detect it timely and again treat it appropriately so that the patient only goes in stage 1 and stage 2. And the other aim was that sometimes these patients can develop late relapses, like our patient. For 1 to 2 years, he's almost silent and then he comes back. So they do need to be followed up carefully for a long term. Okay. Yeah. I think, sir, Dr. Pradeep sir is also there. Sir, would you like to comment? I think I saw sir's name. Is sir there? No, now sir is not there.
He's there, sir.
Sir, can you hear us, sir? Dr. Pradeep, sir?
Yeah, Rohan, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yeah. So, please, would you like to comment?
Yeah, one of the things in vasculitis is we really don't have any study which tells us that if you treat them aggressively with steroids, the neovascularization actually decreases. That's unfortunately we don't have any studies like that. So like Professor Garg always used to say, when the vasculitis is in the periphery, whether to actually treat them aggressively. And there's also a situation like many of our patients, they come in the heal stage in the proliferative process. But when you give them steroids, you still follow them regularly and you still do encounter them progressing to a proliferative stage. Maybe you, Shaurya, and we know there's youngsters, I think you should plan a long-term study where you give steroids in one group and not give steroids, because this is a process where you'll evaluate maybe for 2 years in the minimum and maybe for 3+ years long-term to see whether steroids actually decrease the neovascular process, And the other question is why was this patient treated when you just have capillary non-perfusion? That's not a recommendation at all. The recommendation again is when there is early neovascularization, that's the time you actually treat these patients. But of course, many of them get treated outside. So I typically don't treat them if just CNPs that are there.
So in the left eye, in the nasal area, there was a hint of early neovascularization developing.
Yeah, that's true. But I think he was already, when in the presentation, he said he'd already been lasered, right?
No, sir. Laser, we have done the laser, sir. Left eye.
Acha, okay. I thought he had already lasered. He was lasered already when he came to us, I thought.
No, he was only on steroids for past 10-15 days before coming to us.
Okay. Yeah, so in that situation, Rohan, again, whether it's an active disease that we were seeing nasally, or it was the new vessel was corresponding to that active area, right?
Yes, sir. It was at the edge of the non-perfused and perfused, and
the new vessel, no, and that was you saw that there was activity also, right?
Yes, activity is a little more peripheral to it, but yes, in the same quadrant.
Yeah, so again, in that situation, in the presence of activity, whether to laser immediately or do it under steroid cover, that's again a gray zone. So, but I think the emphasis is only when new vessels develop, you laser these patients, I think.
Yes. Thank you, sir. So, any questions from the residents?
So there is one question here.
Yeah.
So which immunosuppressant should we start within steroid non-responders, and how should we taper it?
See, immunosuppressant is again a very big topic. I think we'll have a separate discussion on that. But mostly what we are using is azathioprine or methotrexate. But how to start, when to start, that is again a very difficult, long discussion. So, based on this case, any specific question about active vasculitis, differentials, or something you want to ask?
Rohan, just clarify for, I don't know who asked that question.
Sir, I asked, sir, when do we laser in a case of active vasculitis? If it's there, if it's just neovascularization is there, or just prophylactically we need to laser?
Yeah, Priyadarshana, I'll just cover the previous question also, where he said that steroid. Who asked the previous question, Rohan?
So I don't know. It's in the chat box somewhere.
Yeah, no, the previous question, no, where they said he used the word steroid resistant. So it's unusual to have steroid resistant kind of vasculitis. And the moment you have steroid resistant cases, you will again have to work up for an infectious etiology. That's a very strong indicator that you're dealing with something that is not purely inflammatory in nature. The possibility that you're missing an infection, number one. Number two, there's some disturbance. Yeah, the other issue there when you say steroid resistance is that when it is threatening the macular area or there is an involvement of the optic nerve head, in those cases, there are two options that you have. One is to use the newer biologics, which act immediately, and the only agent which of the old anti-tumor or anti-cancer drugs, only cyclophosphamide pulse acts immediately. The rest of the immunosuppressants like methotrexate, Imuran, even the newer mycophenolate, they all take a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks for the effect to show up. So you cannot kind of start these agents if it is steroid resistant. Okay, but it's very, very unusual to see steroid resistant cases. So one other addition over here is patients who have Behçet's disease, confirmed Behçet's disease. It's imperative to start immunosuppression along with the steroids because they have a lot of, they have very high risk of vision loss due to optic nerve involvement. So this is one condition where immunosuppression becomes mandatory. Okay, so you start, Imuran or methotrexate, because by the time you're tapering the steroids, the methotrexate or Imuran is setting up its effect. So you have to start it almost at the same time.
Basically, what Behçet sir wants to give is that non-infectious idiopathic vasculitis or non-infectious vasculitis, most of it should respond to steroids within 10 to 15 days. If it is not, then we have to look at alternate causes. And question of starting immunosuppressants is either in 3-4 situations where you started primarily at this initial stage itself, one of which is Behçet's. Otherwise, you started only if your patient is becoming too much steroid dependent or is requiring steroids very frequently and throwing relapses very frequently. And Priyadarshana, about that laser in active vasculitis, the laser, like sir said, which should be done only when the new vascularization develops. So by the time new vascularization develops, most of the patients, the activity would have subsided. So like in our patient also, it was on the waning side, the activity. So if a patient has active vasculitis also and new vascularization also, whether we should laser it, that is a gray zone. So Sumant is asking, is there any role of anti-VEGF here? So see, and most of the cases we can manage, if there is neovascularization also, we can manage by sectoral laser. If there is some macular edema also and active vasculitis, we are giving steroids in some form or the other, and we are. So most of the cases would not require anti-VEGF. Rare situations when there is too much of macular edema, you can just give it as a supplement, as a temporary agent, but it is not the final therapy for anything. Or if some patient is having a lot of neovascularization, you can supplement your laser with an anti-VEGF, but that is only for a temporary phase, not as a long-term persistent therapy as you would probably do in other disorders like diabetes or ARMD. Sir, you would like to add something?
No, I think only addition here is, I think when you give anti-VEGF to these patients, you have to be extremely cautious because I think the progression into fractional detachment and worsening is much higher than in a diabetic patient, probably because of the acuteness of the process. So I think that's one thing that we have to be careful when you give anti-VEGFs in these cases, vasculitis patients. I think there's a study from RP Center only, I think under Dr. Azad. When Sir was there, I think they've reported that there was acute worsening of the condition when Avastin was given. It's reported in Retina sometime back.
So mostly we can avoid it unless it becomes absolutely necessary or you want a early response in some situations.
I think there are no questions. There are no further questions. I think we can conclude here. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, Praful. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you. It was nice presentation. Thank you very much.
क्या बंद करना है?